Hey, folks. Here on Amidon Planet, the goal is to provide informative and thought-provoking content on the never-ending quest to learn how to teach better. And that includes today's episode, which contains content around the Rwandan genocide and the reconciliation, forgiveness surrounding that event. Rick Balkin is going to come on and talk about that. And obviously, when we're talking about such sensitive subject matter, it's important to acknowledge that some descriptions and imagery that we're going to share may be disturbing or distressing to listeners. And we understand the gravity of discussing such tragic events and endeavor to handle the content with the utmost sensitivity and respect, but it is a conversation. It is an exchange. It's a back and forth. And so we also recognize that individuals may have varying levels of comfort with such graphic content. In other words, listener discretion is advised. And if you find certain descriptions or imagery to be too distressing, we encourage you to prioritize your well-being and consider skipping ahead or listening with caution. Thank you for your understanding. Here we go. Welcome to Amidon Planet. I'm your host, Joel Amidon. Thank you for joining me in this never-ending quest to learn how to teach better. Today, on episode 106 of the podcast, I am joined by Dr. Rick Balkin as he returns to Amidon Planet to discuss an experience he had learning about reconciliation in Rwanda. Some of the most awful images that he's ever seen versus some of the most beautiful instances of forgiveness he's ever witnessed. And Rick is a forgiveness expert. As you remember, he's visited our podcast a couple times, one to talk about counseling youth, but then the other was talking about his book, Practicing Forgiveness. And we'll put links in the show notes of both of those episodes. And so I was happy for Rick that he got a chance to, got invited to participate in this experience, and then is thinking about turning this experience that he had into something that others can have through here at the University of Mississippi. And so I'm not going to delay. This is a conversation that I'm just glad to have, like that Rick stopped by and said, hey, I'd like to talk about this. Just like the idea of I had an experience and I want to like decompress. I need to share. And that's what I love is like being able to share those conversations, because it's wonderful that one, to have somebody else that you can share those conversations with, but then it's also another thing to share those conversations with others. And that's, and again, a goal of the podcast. And then to think about, Rick is an expert in forgiveness. I mean, he's done a lot of work around that. He's written about it, but then also to get this like next level experience, I think I was happy for him, but then also to just the fact that we get to learn from it is great. And even thinking about what does this mean for creating such experiences so you can learn how to teach better, such powerful experiences, right? And learning how to teach better, like these power of moments. And that makes me think of that book we talked about, Chip and Dan Heath, I think Gary Williams and I. This is very early on in the Amidon Planet podcast, but the power of moments. And it sounded like Rick was having, when he's talking through this, it sounded like he's having one of those moments. So without further delay, here is my conversation with Dr. Rick Balkin talking about Rwanda, genocide, and reconciliation. All right, Rick Balkin. Hey, welcome back to Amidon Planet. How are you?
I'm doing for having me once again.
Yeah, this is great. We had a little bit of a, I don't know, like a disruption to the earlier part of our semester, but we still got this thing on the schedule, and so glad that you get to share a little experience about a trip that you got to take to Rwanda. So, and I know when you do your little wanders around the hallways, and I, kind of had something, you're like, do you still do the podcast? I got someone I want to talk about. So I was just excited that you wanted to come and share.
Yeah, this was an amazing experience, and certainly no disrespect to any study abroad program. I think any study abroad program, you can get some cultural insights and learn new things. But maybe you go to Dublin and go to Guinness Brewery and get to try a fresh Guinness beer. That's not Rwanda.
Yeah.
and the experience, I would say, was very transformational.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
So how did it come to be though, Rick? Like how did this even start?
so, as you know from one of our previous podcasts, I wrote a book on forgiveness,
Hmm.
and I've gotten to do a number of speaking engagements related to that topic, and also do some. I published research that was a build up to the book.
Hmm.
One of my colleagues, who I've known for 20 years, he is the former dean at the College of William and Mary and is now serving on faculty. He's been doing the study abroad in Rwanda program. This was his seventh year,
Oh, wow. Okay.
and we're at a conference together, and he says, "You know, Rick, with your area on forgiveness, you need to do this." And yeah, Spencer Niles, he's a friend, he's a mentor, and so when he says something like that to me, I listen.
Yeah.
And uh, I've been looking for some type of international work and study that I could do related to my research, and this presented itself, and I'm like, you know what? Let's do this. And so I did. I went to Rwanda for 2 weeks with Dr. Niles and his students that he brings over in his study abroad program, and got to meet with the students, got to do a little work with them, kind of was a participant observer. Uh, and this entire program is coordinated through the Aegis Trust, which has a focus on genocide prevention.
Okay.
And I was introduced to uh, some officers in Aegis Trust, and they're like, "Rick, we've heard about you. We've been watching your podcasts on forgiveness, and thank you for your work, and welcome to Rwanda." And I was just kind of like, "Okay, this is
Wow.
a thing. I'm doing
Yeah,
this."
yeah.
Um, and so that's how it evolved. And you know, uh, I've been so moved by the experience, and I went there thinking, if this pans out, I would love to be able to bring this experience to the University of Mississippi, and
Mm.
do a study abroad program, and that's been put in motion, and still some work to do, but that's something that I hope to see in the future. This is Dr. Niles. He just did his seventh trip, or his seventh year, bringing students to Rwanda, and I'm like, you know what? I want to do the same thing.
Well, what kind of work are they doing? I mean, or maybe this is like the story of the trip. But like just what's Dr. Niles's uh, entry
Yeah,
into wanting to go to and take students to Rwanda?
yeah. So he was doing a speaking engagement in his area of career development, and the right people were there, and they said, "Hey, we want to talk to you," and he was open to the opportunity. And so the Aegis Trust is about genocide prevention and peace education. So students who go there all get a certificate having of completion of this peace education course.
Hmm.
So it's much more than just seeing Rwanda,
Yeah, yeah.
going to genocide memorials and going to a reconciliation village, and seeing the culture. It's more than that. There's coursework involved where you do. The Aegis Trust has a staff. And the staff is very striking because these are individuals in their um, some are in their mid 30s, some are in their mid to late 20s. So keep in mind that the genocide of Rwanda happened, and there was a buildup to it, where thousands, tens of thousands of people were killed
Mm.
building up to it. But in beginning April 7th, 1994, um, you know, over this period of time, this 100 days, 100 days. approximately 1 million people were killed.
My goodness.
And, and so these 35-year-olds were 5 years old
Mm,
and they lost everyone. Just, think for a moment, what would it be like if I had no parents, no grandparents, no aunts, no uncles, no cousins? You've lost everyone.
yeah.
What would that be like? You know, think of all the family stories you would have never heard.
Hmm.
Think of what you would lose in terms of your sense of identity and history and connection. All that was gone
Mm,
for these individuals. And so these were our teachers.
wow.
And, you know, for 2 weeks, we have teachers who are teaching us their trauma. And, that's humbling
Hmm.
because they're not just doing it for this 2 weeks. This is their job. This is what they
Yeah.
do, you know. Yeah, and it's, uh, it brought me into contact with the darkest atrocities of humanity, but also some of the brightest moments of forgiveness and reconciliation. You know, because you have to rebuild the country after this,
Right.
and you know, um, genocide is unimaginable. But as I'm listening to this, it was just the violence. It wasn't simply, not even simply, but it wasn't the Rwandan military doing this. That was part of it.
Yeah.
It was 85% of the population of Rwanda. It was your neighbors coming over with machetes
Mm,
and shovels and scissors and whatever they could take with the decision of it was time to do the work. That's what they called it. And these, and this begins in, this doesn't begin in 1994. This begins, in 1959. So there's this 30-year buildup
mm,
to what's about to transpire. You are, imagine, you're born and you are raised believing that Tutsis are cockroaches that should be exterminated. And that's just the way you were raised.
yeah.
So, when the genocide begins, it is individuals who believed they were doing, and who were doing the government's work. They thought what they were doing was patriotic.
And what happened in 59 that you said that that's where it started?
Well, you can't really start in 1959. You really have to start with colonization.
Yeah.
And Germany colonizes Rwanda, brings in religion. Germany loses World War One, and around 1923, I believe, is when the Belgians come in and replace the Germans, and they do a few things. One is they present themselves as anthropologists,
Mm,
uh, interested in the history of the people. So Rwanda was a monarchy. There was a king,
hmm.
and you had a caste system of Tutsis, Hutu, and Twa. Tutsis were the ruling class. They had the wealth. Wealth was defined by cattle. Hutu had some cattle, not as much, and Twa weren't really. They were more of the sustainable farming.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, and so the minority, of course, was the ruling class, the upper class, but it was a mobile system. You could acquire wealth, you could acquire cattle and become a Tutsi.
Right.
You lose wealth and become a Hutu. You could marry in. There was a merging of Tutsis and Hutus. It wasn't uh, it wasn't uh, a static caste system. It was a fluid caste
Yeah.
system.
Yeah.
The Belgians came in and changed that. Um, in 1932, they introduced identity books,
Mm.
identifying, yeah, sound familiar?
Yeah.
Identifying individuals as Tutsi, Hutu, or Twa. Now, how did they define them? They defined them based on their physical characteristics.
Wow.
They would actually measure noses. And if you had a longer, thinner nose, you were identified as more European looking and were Tutsi. And they enabled the Tutsi class. They copulated with the Tutsis to promote them. And this goes on for decades until 1959. And in 1959, the king dies, and the Tutsis, who are now, or Rwanda, who is now a protectorate
Hmm.
of Belgium, they want independence. And that is when the Belgians turn on the Tutsis and say, no, no, we're going to empower the Hutus now.
Huh.
So, and the Hutus are, are 85% of the
Right.
population of Rwanda. And they begin this campaign using, using newspapers, using, all sorts of propaganda,
Yeah.
Create the Hutu 10 Commandments to denigrate the Tutsis. You won't marry a Tutsi. You won't do business with a Tutsi. And you had identity cards. You knew who was who.
Uh-huh.
So that, and so
And it
that's
simmers up to that point in 1994.
right, right. Over the course of 30 years. I mean,
Right.
there's a famous editorial cartoon where it shows a patient with a doctor, and the doctor says, what seems to be the problem? The patient is saying, Tutsi, Tutsi, Tutsi. So, um, and it was this very purposeful buildup of creating division, and creating a radicalized education devoid of critical thinking to denigrate a population.
Wow. So then you experience through the experience that Dr. Niles has created um,
Yeah,
to work within to come and visit and learn. I mean, obviously learn a bunch, and you're educating me and educating listeners out there about kind of some of the history behind it. And obviously we can put some links and resources for people that want to learn more about things. But what? So then, how does your experience with Rwanda start up?
yeah. So first, this is an experience that was designed as much by the Aegis Trust,
Okay. Yep.
you know, as well as Dr. Niles and the College of William and Mary.
Hmm.
Um, but you know, day one, we are um, at the Kigali Memorial, where the Aegis Trust also operates. And so Kigali is the capital of Rwanda. And this is just kind of an interesting aside, but for your listeners who are, born and raised in the United States, you know, we took a class called World History, and we learned about Greek and Roman history, and then we learned about European history. I get to Rwanda and I quickly realize I know nothing about African history.
Hmm.
This class that we call
Right.
world history isn't world history,
Right.
because I know nothing about this continent. So, you know, that that's part of this experience, is just acknowledging what you don't know.
Right.
Um, one of the first questions our guide asks us, because you arrive in Kigali and it's a very westernized city. It's hopping and bopping. It's, and she says, this is a very safe city. There is a large police presence. What did you expect when you came here? Nobody wants to answer that question. All right. I mean, honestly, there was one Black American female student in our group. The rest of us were white.
Mm-hmm.
And so, none of us want to answer that question of what we thought we might see. I don't even know if I even asked myself what I thought I was going to see when I landed in Kigali. But it looked like a pretty westernized city, you know. So we get in there that night. The next morning, we are at the Kigali Memorial, where 250,000 people are buried in mass
Wow.
graves. And it's being described to us. There are, people share a grave. There are often parts of people in a grave. Um, because so much of the killing didn't happen with guns. It happened with machetes. It happened with something they called masu, which was nails into a piece of wood that
Mm-hmm.
people were bludgeoned to death with. And so this is not you know, this is not a slow death.
No.
This is a very, very torturous, painful way to die. And um, Hutus who, because this is again 85% of the population, who didn't want to participate in this, were considered traitors. So you either participate or you die.
Mm.
So our first day is at the Kigali Memorial, learning the history. Um, and it's it's hard to take in. The campus is beautiful. There's a rose garden. It's very respectful. There's a coffee shop. There's a restaurant. There,
Right.
there's a gift shop. Um, all operated through the Aegis Trust. There are mass graves. Um, there's a museum, and so it is. Um, it's hard to take in, uh, and you have a guide who brings you in through and guides you through the history, and there's lots to read, and you learn everything about. They have a special section of dedicated to children who were murdered. Um, that's day one.
Mm.
Day two, we went to two genocide memorials. Um, so during the 60s and 70s, Tutsis were moved. There were smaller attempts to enact violence. There was um, uh, a refugee. They had refugees who went to Uganda, Congo, who ran away. Tens of thousands of Tutsis would be killed at various times throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s. Building up to this, and almost like a trial. Can we do this
Mm-hmm.
to see what would happen? Um, and people would get arrested, but then they'd be let go. Um, and it was through Uganda that the Rwandan Patriot Front. It was refugees who had served in the Ugandan army and would we're going to take our country back.
Mm.
Um, so but while all that's going on, Tutsis were being relocated to regions that were infested with tsetse flies to cause more death. And so that, and so two of the genocide memorials that we visited were on church grounds because churches were supposed to be a safe haven, and they weren't.
Mm.
The priests had been removed, and um, tens of thousands are executed. Um, I'm just warning your listeners here. This is pretty graphic.
Yeah.
They were killed in the church. Children and mothers to be hid in the religious school. Women were raped and infected with HIV. Women had their wombs cut out. Infants were thrown against the wall.
Mm.
It's this brick wall that 30 years later, you can see the red stains from the blood on the wall. That's still there. They have on display clothes that the victims wore, which have been used to also help family members, surviving family members, identify their family.
Mm-hmm.
They have the burials on the site, you can see. They have the weapons that were used, shovel heads. Yeah. Machetes, bludgeoning tools. It's and then after that, we go to a reconciliation village.
Can I pause you for a second, Rick?
Yeah.
Because it seems like this seems like there's a transition that might happen, but like at the one time you're taking in all this stuff, but at the same time, I mean, this is just a representation of it and not it, like you're just
Right.
like, I guess, I don't know. Did you have like some of the emotion, like, oh my gosh, what am I getting into? Or like, I don't know. Just like maybe just thinking about some of the emotions you might have been having at that time, right before you get to the reconciliation village.
So it's so I as a first generation American on my mother's side, who was a Holocaust survivor.
Yeah.
I grew up, reading books by Elie Wiesel, listening to Holocaust stories, listening to my own family's stories, knowing that my great grandmother died in Auschwitz, knowing that my grandfather was in Dachau and got released, and how they came to the United States and how they bribed a Nazi guard on the train, and they end up in London, declared enemies of the state because they have no visa. I mean, these are the stories that I grew up with. And of course, I'd seen photos of survivors of concentration camp. You see the mass graves, of just ditches of dead. This was more vivid. Maybe it's the fact that I could see the weapons that were used. Maybe it's the fact that this went beyond mass extermination. Dying in a gas chamber or being shot. And you asked, what I'm thinking, but they're both extremely horrific. And how can you compare? But at one point I'm thinking, put a gun to my head. Don't take a dull machete.
Yeah.
And hit me repeatedly with it. So, part of me was like, how do you even think of this? How do you engage? So at the time, I'm thinking, how do you even get to this point where you justified this in your head? And it was really the point where I'm hearing about the infants thrown against the brick wall
Yeah.
and just thinking about what kind of sick mind does this? And then I think about the propaganda.
Yeah.
And the word that was chosen to describe Tutsis, which was cockroaches. You know, how do you kill a cockroach? You know, you're not thinking about being merciful to the cockroach.
Right. No.
You stomp on it. Right. Sometimes you stomp on it and it's still crawling, so you hit it again.
Hmm.
Um, and so, you know, the Holocaust, I'm one generation removed. I remember the Rwandan genocide. You know, this
Yeah.
was this was the Clinton Albright, um, Kofi Annan as Secretary
Hmm.
General of the United Nations. This happened in my adulthood.
Right.
I'm in my 20s when this has happened. I'm like 26 years old when this is happening. Um, and and so you ask, all these thoughts. United Nations was aware of what was happening. They left. All right. The Clinton administration refused to acknowledge that this was a genocide. They'd call it genocidal behavior, or they'd call it a civil war, but they wouldn't call it a genocide. When do you kill infants? When you're trying to annihilate,
Right. Yeah.
a population. So I'm thinking about all that. I'm thinking about accountability. I'm thinking about the dehumanizing aspect to this. Um, you know, um, I'm in a mindset where, you know, the you know, it's hard to trust the world right now. After seeing this, you know, um, you know, what good is the United Nations if they don't intervene during these atrocities? These are all the things that I'm thinking and feeling, and anger at my country,
Hmm.
anger at other countries, um, you know, but also not not understanding of how a human being literally turns on their neighbor and decides to, you know what, we've been living next to each other for 10 years. I'm going to execute you. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill your wife. I'm going to kill your children. I'm going to kill you. You know, um, and so it's in that frame of mind that we get on the bus and we go to a reconciliation village. And if you're like, gee, that seems like just a sudden turn of events, where's the transition? I was told that I was never going to have a day in my life like today.
Mm.
And that certainly delivered. Um, because when I got off the bus and it was raining, and we walk into this large building, small, but large in comparison to other buildings in the village, there's men and women clapping and singing
Hmm.
and dancing. And, someone grabs my hands and is like, you're going to dance with me. And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to dance with you. And here I am dancing with this complete stranger to singing I've never heard. And that's just what's happening. And then we all sit down and we hear stories from survivors and perpetrators
All together.
all together. They lived
Wow.
together.
Wow.
Um, you know, now mind you, this is day two.
Day two.
I'm having a drop the mic moment here. I'm
Yeah,
like, what
yeah.
the rest of the strip gonna be? This is day two.
That's unreal.
It it was unreal. Um, it's unreal hearing the stories from the survivors, whether they were a perpetrator or a victim, of hearing how they have gone from being Tutsi and Hutu to Rwandan. And this isn't a sudden shift. This
Yeah.
takes 10 years. But as much as I learned that words matter in promoting this continuum of violence, leadership matters in pulling people out of it.
Well, I guess, how do they, I mean, you're saying the words matter leadership, but then you're talking about this moment where they start, how do they even set that, set that stage, Rick? Because you're coming in again from this, seeing these memorials, seeing all these atrocities, to all of a sudden dancing, and now we're going to share. So, like, how do they even set the stage? Because I mean, you must be spinning a little bit when you get to that point.
That's it. I mean, I'm spinning. You know, um, you know, I, I'm walking out of the memorial, the genocide memorials, um, having not not lived through, but seen
Yeah.
just the most unimaginable atrocities of humanity. And I I don't know what I was thinking I was going to see at a reconciliation village. I don't know. I
Yeah.
had a feeling I knew. I mean, I had a feeling that I was going to hear stories of forgiveness, and I was very curious of how do you get there?
But maybe somber, right? Like more it's not going to be
Right.
like, hey, dance party once as soon as you get there. I mean,
It's not
that's
going to be
probably not
that.
what you're expecting, you know?
It is not what I was expecting.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it was, you know, it's not just, you're not just having a bunch of people come out and say, hey, we've reconciled.
Yeah.
It's our story.
Right.
You know, there's a woman, she's in her 70s, and she tells her story about being a mother of nine when she was 46 years old when the genocide starts. Um, she has one child with her who's an infant, and she's carrying that child. She and that child survive. Her children died. Her husband dies. Um, when she was talking, she said that she didn't forgive right away.
Yeah.
Um, she talks about her trauma. She talks about the deaths that occur around her. She talks about being in a refugee camp. She talks about hiding in a swamp for 3 months. Um, and she's very depressed. She's very traumatized. She's in this refugee camp until she comes back to a village or goes to a village, and she learns who killed her family and that some had been released from prison. Because you're thinking to yourself, well, how do they get released from prison? This is 85% of the population. How do you imprison everybody?
Yeah.
You can't. Um, She learns the truth and she finds that helpful. And there's associations that are involved who are bringing together widows and orphans. There's pastors who bring Hutu and Tutsi together to preach about forgiveness. Religion plays an integral role in this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, 7 men in the village ask her for her forgiveness, and she says, "I didn't forgive them." The 7 begin to help her grow crops. Um, they fix the roof on her house. They um, give her cattle. She says, "I became richer and more beautiful." That's how she described
Yeah.
it. But she also said she forgave on her own initiative, not because anyone asked her. Um, she ends up, she adopts 2 children during this time. Um, 2 of her kids, one she was holding, and one of her other children survived. She has 8 grandchildren now. Her granddaughter is the godmother of her perpetrators, one of the people who killed her family. He has daughters. Her granddaughter is, um, her daughter is the godmother to the daughter to yeah uh, to her perpetrator's daughter. So
Wow.
they're now family. I mean, part of this is the government saying, okay, here's some land, here's a goat, here's some crops, here's your houses, you share it, make it work.
Mm.
But it's more than that. There are programs in place, there are people there who are facilitating and helping the healing. And, this takes, for Maria, this takes 7 years.
Mm.
you know and we hear from Filbert too. Filbert is the person who committed genocide, and he didn't even think he was committing a crime. And when he ends up going to jail, he thinks he's going to be executed just like he killed the Tutsis, and instead he gets medical care.
Mm.
And there's a prison fellowship who's talking to him about recognizing what you've done and teaching them to think critically, and and to ask for forgiveness and to confess what you did. And there's people who are like, no, the Tutsis should die. They never come around.
Mm.
They don't get out of prison. But those that do, they also have to deal with the family that they've left because they went to prison.
Yeah.
They have to face those family members and explain to them that don't be mad at the Tutsis, be mad at me for what I did.
Right.
And then you have to deal with the people in your community who you harmed. And so they're victims too. So you're hearing this, at least I was hearing this, and we got a chance to ask questions. One individual, in telling a story, he had lost his parents, he lost all his siblings. He was in the hospital for 6 years. He was spent over 130 days in a coma from a hatchet wound to his head.
Oh.
His leg had been broken with clubs, which is why he couldn't walk unassisted without crutches. The Rwandan Patriot Front, who came from Uganda to fight back, drew his body out from dead bodies. And that's, he gets released. So, the genocide happens in 94. He's released from the hospital in 2000, and he lives in the streets of Kigali. and he's helped by prison fellowship. They'd heard of his village was being rebuilt, and they build his the villagers build him a house. And he goes back to his, he's like, come to the house. Like, no, I'm happy here in the streets. Like, no, come to your house. And he comes to the house, he's carrying a machete because he thinks he's going to be killed.
Yeah, yeah.
And he goes to his house and he's kind of having this trauma response and he's on guard and he's there for 3 days. And then he leaves. He goes back to the streets. He says, I can't handle this. They go back and they get him. He comes back to the village and he ends up they have a picket fence now around his house. And this happens a couple more times where he leaves and he comes back and he said something. He said he realized that people were healing and he was being left behind. He says, when you live with wounds and trauma, you cannot see the kindness around you. And if I did not forgive, I was afraid of being left behind.
Wow. I mean, Rick, that speaks to, I mean, our previous conversations about your book and like, I mean, the importance of forgiveness, how to engage in the practice and why, like, I don't know, like it feels like this is like an exclamation point and an underline to some of the stuff, but then also an addendum to stuff that you've already been writing and researching. But like, I mean, what you hear that story and you hear that aha moment and it's like, yeah, you can't just be like, oh yeah, we're all, like two dudes in Wisconsin would be like, we're good. And like, no, that's not how it works. They're to engage in like, there's the story of what has happened and to acknowledge it from both sides and then to come together. But I don't know, like what was going through your mind when you hear that story, you hear that recognition and then the process too, that they had to gauge to get to that point.
Yeah. Before you can reconcile with others, very often you just have to heal what's here.
Mm-hmm.
You have to heal yourself.
Yeah.
Heal yourself. And certainly that's what was happening with individuals that we heard from, is that they had to work through their trauma. They had to go through some very difficult times.
Yeah.
Interpersonally before they could get to where they are. This man who I'm describing, he's a pastor now.
Wow.
Yeah, it's and he's married to the daughter of the man who killed his family, and they have 4 kids.
Wow. That's incredible. That is incredible.
One of the guides said to us, in 1994, the world left Rwanda.
Mm.
And now Rwanda welcomes the world back.
Wow.
But I really do believe that Rwanda has lessons to teach the world.
Well, and that's what I was just, as you're telling the story and you're talking about some of these, the guides that were, around 5 when this happened.
Yeah.
Well, they went through school, right? And like, what does school look like for someone who's at the entry point of school, right? 5 years old, usually, typically around that time for us. But like, what does school look like where you're in some place that, is probably a part of the government? I don't know how the schools are, but part of the government where this genocide occur and like sprouted from. And I don't know if you have those answers or any insights on that, but just seeing like, what does school look like after something as horrific as that, So
there is a plaque on the in one of the museums that we went to, that describes an occurrence in 1997 um, where uh, where some, I guess it was some military. I'll see if I can read this to you. Um, it was a secondary school, I think,
Mm-hmm.
um, where, and like I said, this is just 3 years afterwards, um, where they walk into um, a classroom and tell the children to separate into Tutsi and Hutu. And the children respond, we're all Rwandan. And
Nice.
so there was this concerted effort during the rebuilding to create a national identity, not one based on Tutsi and Hutu, but one based on being Rwandan. And that's why I said, that's why, leadership matters.
Yeah. And words are powerful, right? Both those
Right,
things.
right. Yeah. And so, I thought it was very interesting that um, that it was kids who became so aware of the separation and quickly recognized the need to not be divisive.
Yeah, I guess you think about like how schools get attacked, in current day in the US, get attacked for certain things, like not wanting things in schools. And because that's what one thing they're saying is like schools are powerful, right? Like
Right,
if you're going to talk about, hey, we're going to be inclusive in schools, right? We're going to acknowledge our diversity. We're going to celebrate our differences. We're going to, or we're going to say like, we're not going to let these divisions that were, basically put us, made genocidal behaviors, like genocide happen. We're going
right.
to, we're going to, we're going to, we're going to come up with this identity that we are Rwandan and that the leadership supports that. And then our words are supportive of that. And that it's
Yeah.
powerful stuff.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And um, but also just very it was very thoughtful how the new leadership, when they um, took over, um, considered not to seek out revenge and
Mm-hmm.
retaliation, but to rebuild. And that's just an immense, what courage that took.
Yeah.
Yeah, that just took a lot of courage to believe that we can rebuild this.
So, Rick, again, you wrote a book about forgiveness where you're trying to teach people about forgiveness, the importance of it, how to engage in it. And so,
Yeah.
I guess overall, how did this experience um, teach you more about forgiveness, the practice of it, engaging in it, the importance of it?
One of the elements that we talked a lot about was, and it's so basic, but it's the importance of active listening.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not going to tell you that active listening is going to, cure the country's ills, you know. But how often do we engage with people and we talk about controversial matters and we focus more on how we're going to respond
Yeah.
as opposed to how we're going to listen and understand. And I think, the lesson that I take from Rwanda is the need to understand, to be less focused on my response, to actively listen, to ask questions. And if that person wants to know how I feel, they're going to ask me. But the reality is, I've been trained as a counselor, number one. Number two, I've been to Rwanda, they haven't.
Yeah.
So I might be engaging in behavior that's not going to be reciprocated.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to listen to you actively. All right. And I'm going to go in with the idea that I can understand you, I can disagree with you, and I can still honor you as a person. And the other person may not be willing to do those things. So, but maybe by demonstrating that, by showing care and compassion to, to the people I'm engaging with, maybe that will be reciprocated back.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me, like, I don't know if you're familiar with Graham Bodie. He's across campus. He does the Listen First project.
Okay. Yeah.
Pretty self-explanatory project, but like some of the same things there too, right? So how can we have a better understanding of each other? And gave him that. Yeah.
Yeah. I've, I think the other pieces that I've walked away with is, assume the best in others. When we quit judging the perpetrators in Rwanda and begin to realize that they grew up with 35 years of propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
That's all they know. I can begin to understand their experience a little bit more. Um, in 100 days, they went from believing Tutsis were cockroaches to being to a government change and being told you're going to prison. But I was doing what the government told me to do.
Yeah.
And so, trying to assume the best in others, that's hard sometimes. And then,
Well, pause that for a second. If they can, like in the reconciliation village or some of the examples, if someone there can assume the best in others under the circumstances and the trauma and everything, like I can do the same thing in the Walmart parking lot,
right.
Sorry,
Right.
Didn't mean to interrupt.
No, absolutely. But the advantage that the people in Rwanda have is they're not trying to air their disagreements out over social media.
Yeah.
They put in a community and say, here you go, make it work.
Yeah.
Deal with each other, interact with each other.
Mm-hmm.
That's very different. And the other piece I would say is being aware of dehumanizing language, being aware of disparaging language. I can't think of any instances where people have been disparaged publicly and have gone, okay, I'm going to change because of that.
Yeah.
So that doesn't produce growth. That doesn't produce change. And so,
well, I talk about it too. I mean, I have some, teachers that are first, pre-service teachers that are first entering into classrooms, and thinking about how powerful their language, like using person first language, like, you might hear someone say, I have a slow kid, right? Or something like, and you're like,
Yeah.
what kind of language is that saying? What kind of preconceived notions are you putting into your own head versus here's a student that maybe has not gotten the opportunities to best use their skills and abilities yet. Now, how do I create a better environment? So like there's two different ways to talk about that same kid, and one, talks about possibilities, and one talks about like a fixed way of experiencing it. And that's, again, those words are powerful.
Yeah, let me read this list to you real quick. This was, as I told you, we took a peace education class, and we listed 10 elements to the continuum of violence.
Mm.
All right, and I'm going to read these off to you, and I want you to, I want you and your listeners to think about where we are at here in the United States.
Yeah.
There's only 10 levels here. Poor living conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe for some, not for everyone, but there's poor living conditions.
Yeah.
Political polarization.
Yep.
The presence of scapegoats.
Mm-hmm.
Marginalization of a population. Followed by destructive ideology.
Okay.
The absence of active bystanders. You show your cell, you record what's happening on your cell phone, but you don't do anything.
Right.
A past history of victimization and current victimization, manipulation of people, dehumanization, genocide.
Wow. Yeah.
I even thought, what about toxic work environments? How far down the continuum we go in a toxic work environment. And so, that really scared me.
Yeah.
It really made me think of, how easy it is. It's almost too easy to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. That's processing.
Yeah. But in the essence of learning about the continuum of violence, we also learn about steps in social reconstruction. And we're presented with a continuum of benevolence. Elie Wiesel, I believe it said, hate is not the opposite of love. Indifferences.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the continuum of benevolence, we have indifference toward one another. You just don't care. Opening up, acceptance, respect, empathy, caring, connection, community, love of self and toward others, and peace. And then steps in social reconstruction, ending violence, democratization, truth telling. In Rwanda, it's against the law to deny the genocide.
Oh, yeah.
The presence of justice, the restoration of justice. So, sometimes you can't fix it. Sometimes you just have to do restorative justice approaches.
Right.
You know, building relationships, healing, forgiveness, unity, and harmony. And I thought, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, but that truth telling I thought was a very interesting component, because sometimes there's just so much disagreement on what the truth is.
Right.
Here was another interesting part of Rwanda that I just have to share. In 2015, they closed the last orphanage.
Wow.
There are no orphanages. And now you think about all the orphans
Mm-hmm.
after genocide. And I would ask people about that. How did you close the orphanages? And they would all say the same thing, where, well, every child deserves a family. I'm like, yeah, but how do you do that? I understand the concept. That's a
Right.
beautiful idea. How do you do that?
Right.
Like, we have governors, we have mayors, we have community leaders. It's like, you have leaders just in your community. I'm like, and they're like, don't you have that in the United States? I'm like, yeah, we call it a homeowners association. And it's not the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but your community leader is like, hey, this child has lost both their parents.
They need a home.
They need a family.
Yeah.
And the community, somebody steps up. And you're like, but how did they step up? And they're like, well, every child deserves a family. This communal sense of responsibility, just impressed me.
Yeah.
How do you get rid of orphanages? Well, every child deserves a family, and it's demonstrated at the highest levels.
Like taking responsibility for what society has produced, and so we're going
Right.
to take care of them, take care of the people.
That's right. Yeah. So that one brought tears to my eyes.
Yeah.
Just talking about it, I was just like,
Wow.
how do you do that? And that doesn't mean there's not problems in Rwanda. Of course there is. There's kids who struggle.
Mm-hmm.
We visited an after-school program, and they had a very westernized concept, I thought, on the wall, and it said, check your regulation, and it had red, green, and blue. If you're on red, regulation was low. What do you need? You need to eat. You need something to, you need to talk. You need to rest.
Yeah.
Or high regulation. You're like, vroom. All right. You need a calm. You need
Mm-hmm.
something calm right now.
Yeah.
Let's go for a walk. Yeah. Or you're regulated. But they had this great graphic of check your regulation. They teach the children about what it means to be regulated.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Well, Rick, I can't imagine. I mean, and like I now get a little bit more insight into the excitement that you had in wanting to share this experience, and then not only share this experience with others through telling stories, or sharing even through. I think you're going to engage in a little bit of writing too, but then also too wanting others to go over and have a similar sort of experience through study abroad program. I mean, I think that's amazing, and and again, it feels like that you said the world is coming to Rwanda, and Rwanda is welcoming the world, because there's lessons to be learned. I mean, even just the lessons that you rattled off 3 things that I wrote down about active listening, assume the best in others, be aware of disparaging language. I mean, I want all my pre-service teachers to be thinking about those things when they enter into a classroom. But then even too, just as we negotiate our day-to-day basis, I keep thinking about the parking lot. I'm like, God. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. Did you have any final words that you wanted to share about this experience, about anything that you want?
I mean, I yeah, the lessons to me are too obvious, and it's not to demean in any way, because I think what we deal with is very real.
Mm-hmm.
But I came into contact with individuals and a society that has dealt with the most horrific atrocities I've ever come across, and has found, in many ways, the people who I came into contact with have found a way to heal. And how can we do that?
Yeah.
There are people, certainly here who are dealing with very real trauma. There are also people who are dealing with frustrations.
Mm-hmm.
Arguing with somebody about politics. These are very divisive, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think, at the core, it's our refusal to listen to one another. And if we could just do that and learn to disagree, but honor the person's dignity,
right,
it would carry us a long way.
Yep. I think too, I like the continuums that you shared, and just how can we, rather than being maybe pushed down like the continuum of divisiveness and towards violence, but more so, how can I actively engage in taking steps towards peace and benevolence? I think that's good too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you, Rick. I appreciate you. Appreciate your time. Appreciate your willingness to join me and share all you've experienced. And we'll put links to anything that we have links to. That we'll put it on the show notes page so that people can check out more.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me once again.
Yeah, no, this is great. Thanks, Rick.
You bet. Take care.
All right, that's going to do it for this episode of Amidon Planet. Show notes can be found at amidonplanet.com/episode 106. Now, for those of you looking for ways to support the podcast, you can subscribe, rate, review, and share this episode, which will allow more people looking for similar content to find it. If you're a Spotify user, really appreciate if you go in and follow and rate in Spotify. Recently moved the podcast over to Spotify, so appreciate all the listens you put on there. So, and if you're looking for other ways to support the podcast, you can submit a question, comment, or suggestion to the mailbag by sending an email to joel@amidonplanet.com. In addition, I'm always looking for opportunities to work with those who are looking to lead people to love others through teaching. If you have an event or opportunity to share, you can either send an email to joel@amidonplanet.com or head to amidonplanet.com/about to fill out the request a call form. Thank you for spending time on Amidon Planet. Thanks to Rick Balkin for sharing his time and expertise. And thanks to Matt Mifflin for the music in this episode. And finally, thank you to all of you out there learning to teach better and be the good in the world by investing in the lives of others. This world is a better place because you have decided to use the gifts you have been given to serve others. Thank you for all that you do. Peace.